Imagine you're in a courtroom. A lawyer quotes a law that clearly says X. The opposing lawyer responds, not with another law, but with a poem that doesn't mention the topic at all. The judge sides with the poem, as that would be bizarre in any legal system on earth. But it's essentially what happens multiple times in the New Testament, and it's one of three interpretive methods that built Christianity. Three methods: typological prophecy, clear text override, and radical allegory. One crucial point before we begin. When New Testament writers interpret Scripture, they mean the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament. The New Testament didn't exist yet as a collection. They were in the process of writing it. The texts they inherited were the texts they reshaped. Method 1, typological prophecy. Psalm 22 was composed centuries before Jesus, somewhere between 1000 and 500 BCE. In its original context, it's a hymn of a righteous sufferer, likely a king or poet crying out to God in anguish. It describes pierced hands and feet, garments divided by lots, mocking onlookers, vinegar offered in thirst, and opens with a devastating cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" A historical critic, someone who asks what a text meant to its original audience, reads this as ancient poetry about ancient suffering, not a prophecy, not about a Messiah. Early Christians read it completely differently. They saw every detail as a coded prediction of the crucifixion. They pierced my hands and feet. The Gospels describe crucifixion. They divide my garments and cast lots. John reports Roman soldiers doing exactly that. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Mark records Jesus crying those precise words from the cross. The Gospel writers didn't just notice these connections. They wove Psalm 22's language into their crucifixion narratives. They shaped the story to match the prophecy. And this is what typological prophecy means. Reading older texts as coded previews of later events, then constructing narratives to fit the pattern. That was prophecy. Now let's look at law. In Mark chapter 10, Pharisees test Jesus with a direct legal question about divorce. They cite Deuteronomy 24, an explicit Mosaic law permitting a husband to write a certificate of dismissal and send his wife away. This isn't ambiguous. It's a clear legal statute directly about divorce embedded in Torah. Jesus dismisses it. He calls it a concession Moses made because of hardness of heart. Then he appeals to two Genesis passages from two separate chapters. Genesis 1, God made them male and female. Genesis 2, a man shall be joined to his wife and the two become one flesh. Neither passage mentions divorce, not once, not even implicitly. In the contrast is stark. On one side, Deuteronomy 24, directly about divorce, unambiguous, dismissed as a concession. On the other, Genesis 1 and 2 about creation and marriage, divorce never mentioned, elevated to the definitive teaching. The ancient world had a recognized interpretive principle: interpret the unclear by reference to the clear. Jesus does the exact opposite. He uses the unclear to override the clear. If overriding a law seems bold, Paul goes further. In Genesis, Sarah, Abraham's legitimate wife, can't conceive. Abraham has a child, Ishmael, with Hagar, Sarah's enslaved servant. Eventually, God fulfills the promise, and Sarah bears Isaac, the covenant heir. The natural symbolic reading is obvious. Sarah, the free wife and mother of the heir, represents Israel and the covenant. Hagar, the slave and outsider, represents everyone else. Any ancient reader will make that assignment without hesitation. Paul flips it entirely. In Galatians chapter 4, Paul maps Hagar, the slave, onto the Mosaic law, present-day Jerusalem, and bondage. Sarah, the free wife, becomes the promise, spiritual freedom, and the new covenant. The Genesis narrative offers no basis for this inversion, none. Paul doesn't argue from the text. He doesn't find hidden clues that support his mapping. He announces it. And he labels his own method explicitly using the Greek word allegorumena, meaning speaking allegorically. This is allegory, reading a narrative as symbolic of something other than its surface meaning. Paul isn't uncovering what the text secretly meant all along. He's overwriting it with a new theological meaning with complete confidence. 3 examples, 1 pattern. In every case, the New Testament writer exercises radical authority over the inherited text. The text doesn't control the interpreter. The interpreter reshapes the text to serve a new theological vision. Psalm 22 becomes a script for the crucifixion. A creation poem overrules an explicit legal statute. A slave woman becomes a symbol of the very covenant she was never part of. These writers weren't careless or dishonest. They operated within recognized traditions, Jewish midrash, Hellenistic allegory, where this kind of creative, authoritative reading was expected and respected. But it is profoundly different from how most people today assume scripture should work. Then these methods build Christian theology. The doctrines that emerged from the New Testament, atonement, the New Covenant, the relationship between law and grace, are inseparable from these interpretive moves. Remove them, and the theological structure collapses. Modern historical criticism asks a fundamentally different question. What did this text mean to its original audience in its original context? That method reaches different conclusions on every example we've seen. Psalm 22 is about an ancient sufferer, not a future Messiah. Deuteronomy 24 permits divorce. Hagar represents the outsider, not the covenant. And this creates a tension that hasn't been resolved in 2,000 years. The foundational texts of Christianity were produced using methods that most modern readers, including many Christians, really would not accept as valid. The question isn't whether these methods are right or wrong. The question is one of consistency. If you insist on historical context, original meaning, and a plain sense reading, you're using tools the New Testament writers themselves did not use. The theology you've inherited was built by the very methods you've set aside. If you read the Bible differently than the people who wrote it, whose Bible are you reading?